Hey guys, tonight we settle in for a long, slow drift back to the sun-baked, blood-stained cobblestones of ancient Rome. Our topic is one you probably haven't spent much time dwelling on, and that's exactly the point. The forgotten female gladiators of ancient Rome. We're talking about the gladiatrices, the women who dared to enter the Colosseum's shadow. Now, as you gently adjust your pillow and let the weight of the day lift from your shoulders, I want you to project yourself right into the heart of the capital Rome around the 1st century CE. You're standing not in the noisy bleachers, but deep beneath the arena, in the hypogum, the maze of tunnels and lifts, cool and damp smelling of sweat fear and wild animal musk. The rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes nearby, muffled by the sheer weight of the stone above. You can feel the vibration of 70,000 people roaring a sound like an ocean trapped inside a stone funnel. Up above the sunlight is a blinding white shock. You're waiting, and when your name or your fighting moniker is called, maybe Achillia or Amazonia names, chosen for their exotic, fierce resonance, you don't walk out to face some hulking, bearded brute with a net and trident. You walk out to face another woman, just as hardened, just as terrified, just as desperately clinging to survival as you are. You see her helmet, crest first, maybe a plume of dyed horsehair swaying gently, then the shining bronze of her greaves, and the leather bindings of her breast strap, a practical, minimal uniform designed for both protection and, let's be honest, spectacle. She might be a Samnite class, armed with a short sword and a rectangular shield. Or perhaps she's a Thraex with a curved scimitar and a small round shield. You probably won't survive this statistically, most gladiators didn't, but for this fleeting moment, you are the focal point of the greatest, most brutal city on earth. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. Hopefully it's late enough for sleep to be calling your name. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We start with the shock of discovery, right? For the modern person, the image of the gladiator is relentlessly masculine. But the Romans, ever the masters of spectacle, understood the power of novelty. When they introduced female fighters, it wasn't an act of gender equality. It was an act of high-octane marketing. They were a quirky tidbit in an already extraordinary menu of violence. Think of them as the surprise act, the event promoters saving their most shocking exhibit for the mid-afternoon slot, just when the crowd might start to get a little sleepy after watching a few too many animal hunts. The mainstream historical fact is that these fights did happen, and they were recorded, albeit sparingly. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing about the reign of Emperor Nero, mentions female participation in a large public games display. He doesn't spend long on it, but the simple, matter-of-fact inclusion in his annals suggests this wasn't a one-off oddity, but a controversial yet recurring feature of Roman life. He describes it with a sneering tone, mind you, suggesting it was beneath the dignity of Rome. But that's Tacitus sneered at everything Nero did as a matter of principle. The terminology itself offers the first clue. These women were not typically called gladiators, which is a masculine Latin noun. They were called gladiatrices, the feminine form, or sometimes more romantically, the Amazons. You remember the Amazons, right? That legendary tribe of fierce female warriors from Greek mythology, often depicted as independent horse riding and exceptionally deadly. By calling them Amazons, the promoters were giving the audience a ready-made narrative. These aren't just slave women fighting. These are mythic, exotic heroines brought to life briefly for your entertainment. It gave the bloodshed a certain theatrical justification. It turned the grim reality into a sensational performance piece. You stand at the edge of the arenas and the arena, and you try to imagine the sensation of being looked at by so many eyes. It's a completely different pressure than your modern performance anxiety. You're not worried about forgetting your lines. You're worried about your lung being punctured. And this is where the second-person present narrative really kicks in. You trudge through the deep, warm sand, feeling it give way under your worn leather boots. The sun, reflecting off the white marble tiers, is almost unbearable. Your breathing, already shallow from nerves, feels strained against the bronze cheek guards of your helmet. You barely notice the weight of your shield. Adrenaline has taken over. You look across the vast, oval expanse, and you see your opponent. She's got the same blank, determined stare as you. Historians still argue whether the gladiatrices were exclusively matched against each other, or if they sometimes fought men. The prevailing evidence suggests woman-on-woman combat was the norm, primarily because the novelty of a woman fighting a man might have undercut the established ritual and gravitas of the male duels. The whole point of the Roman games was to display ritualized martial prowess. A woman defeating a man while shocking might have been seen as making a mockery of the whole enterprise, which was fundamentally rooted in Roman military values. But two women fighting to the death, that was simply exotic novelty. A sort of high-stakes historical equivalent of a celebrity boxing match. You can sense the energy of the crowd. It's not just bloodlust, it's curiosity. You are a paradox to them, a womana, symbol of the household and domesticity in Roman culture, but armed, dangerous, and utterly exposed in the public sphere. And yet this isn't a simple case of women shattering glass ceilings. The vast majority of these women were slaves, criminals, or marginalized individuals, their consent entirely irrelevant. They were property leveraged for entertainment. It's a brutal reality check that you have to face your brief moment of glory is entirely contingent on your owner's ability to market your tragedy. The cheeky reality check I mentioned, you realize standing there in the heat, your simple linen tunic soaked through before the fight has even begun, that your diet over the last few months has been intentionally high carb. You're not building a perfect physique. You're cultivating a layer of subcutaneous fat, sort of biological padding to protect your vital organs from shallow cuts. It's an occupational hazard being a gladiator. You are literally being fattened for the slaughter, or at least for the spectacular injury. This strange carb-heavy diet of beans and barley, often called sagina, gives you a peculiar, somewhat doughy strength designed to extend the spectacle, not necessarily to make you lean and mean. Survival isn't about looking good. It's about not bleeding out immediately. Now take a slow breath. The trumpet sounds. The fight is about to begin. You raise your small shield, and the world narrows down to your opponent, the sand, and the glint of steel. The trumpet blast fades, leaving a ringing silence that lasts only a heartbeat before the crowd noise surges back, but you barely hear it. Your focus is total, narrowed down to the movement of your opponent, that other gladiatrix facing you. You've been through the grind, the preparation, and now we move from the spectacle to the substance, the ludus life and training. This is where the glamour, such as it was, evaporates and the sheer brutal professionalism of the arena surfaces. You, as a recruita, novitia would have been bought or assigned to a ludus, which is the Latin term for a gladiatorial school. This isn't your local gym. It's a fortress, a barracks, and a highly specialized training center rolled into one grim compound. You remember the high walls, the single heavily guarded entrance, and the pervasive smell of sweat vinegar and cheap animal fat. This was your entire world. It was a place of isolation, a necessary measure, to ensure that the fighters, your property after all, didn't run away before their debut. Your quirky tidbit for this section involves the head trainer. He's called the lanista, and he's not usually the one doing the day-to-day instruction. That job belongs to the doctors, often former gladiators who survived their term and now teach their specific fighting style. But the lanista is the businessman, the owner, the guy who buys and sells you like livestock. He's usually a social outcast in Roman society, necessary evil dealing in blood and death, but he holds the power of life and death over you. You remember him checking your teeth and musculature when you arrived like a horse at auction, utterly indifferent to your identity. Historians still argue whether the lanistae who dealt in female gladiators were even more reviled than their counterparts, given the perceived obscenity of training women for the arena. The mainstream historical fact is the rigor of the training. Your days were structured with the kind of unforgiving discipline you'd expect in a legionary camp. It wasn't random sparring. It was highly codified, repetitive drilling. You would start with the palace, a sturdy 6-foot-tall wooden post driven into the ground. You had to practice all your strikes, thrusts, and blocks against this post over and over until the movements became muscle memory. You use wooden practice weapons, arma lusoria, that are deliberately heavier than the real steel, so that when you finally pick up your actual fighting gear, it feels lighter, almost effortless. Think of the sheer burning exhaustion. You trudge around the training yard in the morning mist, your body aching from the previous day's drills. You're trying to perfect the low sweeping cut required for your Thraex style. If you remember from Section 1, the Thraex uses a psycha, a short curved sword designed to bypass an opponent's shield and stab at the kidneys or hamstring. You have to practice that specific awkward angle hundreds of times, the wooden sword stinging your palms. The doctor stands over you, not shouting, but using that low, chilling voice that cuts through the fatigue, correcting your stance. The diet we briefly touched on, the sajanawas, essential. You sit down in the evening in the communal dining hall, your stomach rumbling. The diet is primarily barley beans and oatmeal, a surprisingly vegetarian regimen for someone engaged in such physical violence. It's practical, though. This combination is cheap, easy to store, and provides the slow-burning carbohydrates needed for endurance training. And yes, it builds that protective layer of fat. The Romans literally called gladiators hordeari, or barley eaters. You sip a gruel of warm water and ash that's right ash, which they believed helped strengthen the bones due to its calcium content. It tastes like dirt, but you choke it down knowing it's part of the bargain for survival. It's the ultimate ancient protein shake. This intense physical regimen was a leveler. Whether you were a slave girl dragged from a foreign land or, more shockingly, a freeborn Roman woman who had volunteered for the life auctoratae, the training was the same. The heat, the grueling pace, the constant fear of a misplaced blow breaking a finger. It didn't care about your former social status. You'd think that a free woman voluntarily taking this on would be afforded special treatment. But in the ludus, you're simply a fighting unit. You endure the sparring sessions, too. They are controlled but terrifying. The goal isn't to kill, but to injure enough to practice fighting while exhausted and in pain. You remember one session where you took a solid blow to your practice helmet. It didn't pierce, but the shock of the impact still left you dizzy, your ears ringing like tiny bells. The doctor simply nodded and told you to get back to the palace immediately. No breaks, no pity. You had to learn to fight through the pain. Let's step out of the ludus for a moment, just for a quick light joke. You realize that ancient Rome's idea of a high-carb energy bar was essentially just fermented barley slathered in grease. You're pretty sure if a modern CrossFit athlete saw your diet, they'd faint from the lack of kale and whey protein. And yet this is what fuels the deadliest women in the empire. The isolation of the ludus extends beyond the physical walls. You are socially dead. Gladiators of all genders were considered infames people, stripped of legal and social standing. Even if you were born free by joining the arena, you had voluntarily forfeited your good reputation, your citizenship rights, and your standing in the eyes of the law. You are lower than a pimp or an actor. You are a tool for entertainment, a commodity that bleeds. It's a chilling reminder that your fame, if you achieve it, will be attached to an utterly degraded status. You're essentially the celebrity criminal of ancient Rome, equally famous and reviled. The training ensures that when you finally step onto that arena sand, as you did at the end of Section 1, you are not just a person fighting, but a precise, weaponized automaton. Every step, every shield parry, every thrust has been drilled into you. The point of the ludus isn't courage, it's consistency. It's the ability to perform the moves flawlessly even when you're staring death right in the face. You're not fighting for glory. You're fighting for the slim chance of seeing another meal of barley and ash. You've felt the pain of the palace, choked down the barley gruel, and endured the utter social death of the ludus. Now let's move past the physical reality and search for the gladiatrix in the actual records, moving from the arena sand to the dusty scrolls. This is where the story gets frustratingly faint. Literary whispers and missing names. You're stepping into the library of ancient Rome, but instead of finding a dedicated section on female combat, you find scattered footnotes and bitter asides. The mainstream historical fact is that the literary evidence for gladiatrices is almost exclusively negative, written by elite male historians who viewed their existence as a sign of imperial decadence and moral decay. They weren't interested in reporting the facts. They were interested in criticizing the emperors who allowed such shameful spectacles. Take Tacitus, the historian we met in Section 1. His writing is characterized by deep aristocratic scorn. When he mentions the games organized by the infamous Emperor Nero around 64 CE, he doesn't celebrate the bravery of the female fighters. Instead, he condemns the whole affair as an outrage. He writes that women of rank descended into the arena, suggesting that it was the mixing of social classes, the presence of respectable women, that was the real scandal, not the violence itself. You can almost hear him sighing dramatically across the millennia. This tells you a lot. The focus for the Roman elite wasn't on if a woman should fight, but which women were fighting. A slave woman's life was cheap, and her fighting was just commerce. A noble woman fighting. That was a terrifying collapse of social order. Then you have the poet Juvenal, known for his biting satire. He is arguably the most vocal and angry source on the subject. Juvenal wrote an entire passage mocking the noblewoman or matrona who preferred the sword and shield to needlework and domestic duties. His poetry paints a vivid, yet thoroughly poisoned picture of the high-status woman who abandoned her traditional role. You can imagine her, she's running around the villa in her training gear, barking orders smelling of vinegar and cheap oil, neglecting her husband and her family duty. Juvenal finds this absolutely hilarious and simultaneously deeply offensive. He asks with gentle sarcasm, "What sense of modesty can a woman show who puts on a helmet and ignores her own sex?" His text is the ultimate quirky tidbit, because he gives us details like the female fighter's fondness for a certain type of transparent tunic and the way she would strap up her gear, but all delivered with a heavy layer of misogynistic judgment. You read Juvenal's words and you realize the gladiatrix was a powerful symbol in Roman public debate. She represented the blurring of gender lines, the decay of traditional Roman values, and the general moral chaos that the conservative elite feared was engulfing the empire. She was less a historical figure to them and more a convenient rhetorical punching bag. Every time a historian or poet mentions you, they are almost never talking about your skill or your courage. They are talking about their society's decline. It's a classic case of the woman being used to make a point about the man specifically, the emperor who allowed this behavior. The silence is as revealing as the scattered mentions. No great Roman writer composed an epic poem praising the bravery of the gladiatrix Hermione, for example, or a detailed biography of the victorious Amazonia. Their stories were simply too low-class or too politically dangerous to document in depth. The written word belonged almost exclusively to the upper class, and they had no desire to immortalize the figures they despised. This leads us to the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the lack of pervasive written evidence means female gladiators were genuinely rare or merely ignored by the official record. Was it a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence that Nero or Domitian staged just to shock the public, or was it a regular, if small, feature of the provincial games that the high society writers just couldn't be bothered to notice? The answer likely lies somewhere in the middle. We know that Roman writers often suffered from what we might call elite bias. They only recorded what was relevant to the political and moral concerns of their own class. If an event happened far from Rome, or involved only the lowliest slaves, it often went unmentioned. So while Tacitus mentions the scandalous noblewomen fighting in Rome, there could have been dozens of fights between enslaved women happening in smaller arenas across the provinces, completely beneath his notice. Imagine you're trying to piece together your own history. You trudge through the crumbling remains of a library, and all you find are 2 lines on a papyrus from a grumpy old man complaining about your choice of career. It's disheartening. Your fame, though intense in the moment and absolute roar of attention on the day of the games, was profoundly ephemeral. You were a spectacle, quickly consumed and immediately forgotten. Your life was disposable, and so was your story. This ephemeral quality is perhaps one of the reasons the female fighter was so desirable for the games organizers. They were shocking novel and entirely controllable. They didn't threaten the established social hierarchy because they were either infames, low status, or auctoratae, voluntarily taking on low status. You were designed to generate maximum buzz with minimum long-term historical consequence. You close the metaphorical scroll, the dust settling on the table. You realize that to find the gladiatrix, you can't rely on the gentlemen of history. You have to turn from the words of the elite to the hard, cold, undeniable evidence left behind in stone. That's where the next part of your journey takes you, to the visual, physical proof that the poets tried so hard to deny. You've searched the library and found only scornful whispers. Now you pivot from the unreliable words of moralizing poets to the stubborn permanence of stone. Your quest for the forgotten gladiatrix takes a dramatic turn as you encounter the most tangible, most celebrated, and arguably most definitive piece of physical evidence, the famous Halicarnassus relief. Imagine you are standing in a Roman marketplace surrounded by the ordinary clamor of daily life. Then your eye catches a section of a marble plaque, a funerary relief commissioned centuries ago. This artifact, found in modern-day Bodrum, Turkey, the ancient city of Halicarnassus, isn't just a scribble in a book. It's a photograph carved into stone. It presents a mainstream historical fact that no snobbish historian could ignore: a depiction of 2 female figures fully armored, locked in combat. The relief shows these two women facing each other in the classic gladiatorial pose. They are identified by their fighting names, proudly inscribed above their heads, Amazonia and Achillia. Think about that for a moment. They weren't just two women fighting. They were individuals with adopted powerful personas names, deliberately chosen to evoke the fierce, mythic warrior archetype we discussed in Section 1. To the Roman audience, this was a clash of legends. You study the figures closely. They are shown mid-fight, but they aren't wearing the full heavy armor of the male fighters. Their equipment is relatively light. They wear helmets with crests protecting their heads and disguising their faces, which paradoxically might have been a way to preserve some shred of female modesty while they engaged in an immodest activity. They wear protective shin guards auctoratae on their legs, and they carry shields, probably the small rectangular type that suggests the provocateur or murmillo fighting styles. Crucially, they are shown without tunics. They are fighting bare-chested. This detail of fighting topless is the central quirky tidbit of the relief. It serves a triple function. First, it's practical, reducing the number of places an opponent can grab or rip cloth. Second, it's sensationalized. It's a deliberate choice by the lanista, the owner remember him from Section 2, to enhance the spectacle, feeding the audience's fascination with the unusual sight of the female body weaponized. Third, and perhaps most subtly, it strips away any pretense of being a respectable Roman matron. The respectable Roman woman was always covered. To fight bare-chested was to fully embrace the social death infamia of the arena. Now look at the inscription beneath the image. It doesn't describe the fight itself, but the result. It states that both women were honorably discharged missio. They fought to a draw. This is incredibly important. It means the crowd, the editor, the organizer of the games, or perhaps even the emperor himself was so impressed by the bravery and skill of the match that they chose not to force a final fatal blow. They were spared. You can feel a small wave of relief wash over you. For Amazonia and Achillia, the roar of the crowd turned into a rare, life-saving plea. They survived that day. This outcome fuels the open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the fact that both Amazonia and Achillia were granted missio suggests that fights between gladiatrices were less frequently to the death than male bouts, or if it simply reflects a single exceptional case. Was it a policy to spare female fighters because they were a rare commodity? Or did the two women just put on an exceptionally skillful performance that captivated the audience? The answer is lost to us, but the possibility that their lives were slightly more valued, if only for their novelty, is a comforting thought amidst the surrounding brutality. The relief is a powerful counterpoint to the sneering comments of Juvenal. Juvenal described the gladiatrix as a debased spectacle. The relief depicts them as skilled, formidable warriors worthy of honor. The fact that an expensive permanent monument was commissioned to celebrate their duel suggests a deep cultural impact, at least in that city. It was a proud moment for the lanista, who owned two women capable of putting on such a thrilling performance. A gentle joke here, your lanista probably framed this marble slab like a proud parent showing off a trophy, while simultaneously calculating how much he could now charge for your next fight. As you trace the cool marble with your fingers, you recognize your own equipment in the carving. You realize that your training in the ludus was focused not just on fighting to kill, but on fighting to entertain, to create a spectacle worthy of a shared missio. The choreography, the stamina, the precise footwork, it was all designed to maximize the drama of the clash. You realize the relief immortalizes the sheer professional skill you worked so hard to attain. This single piece of stone, unearthed far from Rome, carries more weight than all the Roman historians combined. It names 2 women, defines their roles, and records their honorable survival. It rescues them from the anonymity of the written records. Amazonia and Achillia, through a fluke of preservation, stand as eternal proof that you, the forgotten female fighter, were not just a fantasy, but a flesh and blood reality in the Roman world. You remember the sting of the barley diet, the burning muscles, and you nod. They earned that missio. You've seen the marble proof of Amazonia and Achillia, a fleeting monument to their survival. But their survival was the exception, not the rule, and their very existence caused deep anxiety among Rome's ruling class. This tension brings us to the inevitable turning point, imperial disdain and the ban. You have to remember that your spectacle, while thrilling to the masses, was a moral headache for the senators and emperors trying to project an image of sober, traditional Roman virtue. The mainstream historical fact is that the practice of women fighting in the arena was not merely discouraged. It was outright banned by an imperial decree. The Emperor Septimius Severus in 200 CE issued an edict that formally prohibited women from participating in gladiatorial contests. This ban is the most concrete evidence we have that the practice was persistent enough to require imperial intervention. You don't ban something that never happens right. Severus, who was generally a pragmatic and successful emperor, wasn't acting out of a sudden concern for women's safety or rights. His motivation was entirely about social control and imperial dignity. The elite felt that the spectacle was becoming too disorderly, too morally corrupting, and crucially, it was starting to attract high-status women, the wives and daughters of senators and equestrians who were seeking notoriety. This was the ultimate scandal that Tacitus and Juvenal had previously only complained about. When upper-class women began to actively take part, even if they only hunted animals venatrices instead of fighting gladiators, it was seen as a grave threat to the Roman social fabric, which relied on strict, visible gender roles. You can imagine the imperial reasoning. You're the emperor sitting high in your box, trying to run an enormous empire, and down on the sand, you see the wife of Senator Aulus brandishing a spear. It's a bad look. It suggests that the traditional Roman virtues gravitas, dignity, and pietas, duty, have completely collapsed. It makes the aristocracy look foolish and unrestrained. The arenas were supposed to be a place where low-status individuals reinforced the power of the high-status organizers, not where the organizers' families degraded themselves. The quirky tidbit in Severus's reign concerns the context of the ban. Severus wasn't just worried about noble women fighting, he was worried about noble women dressing for the fight. The spectacle often featured women performing in skimpy or even provocative attire, leaning into the sexualized novelty we'll discuss later. By fighting in public, these women were adopting the infamia social shame of the gladiators. For Severus, banning the act was the only way to ban the shame. The Roman mind struggled to separate the warrior from the spectacle. This leads directly into the open scholarly debate phrase historians still argue whether the ban issued by Septimius Severus was uniformly enforced across the vast Roman Empire, or if the practice of female gladiatorial combat merely went further underground in the distant provinces. Think about the sheer logistical challenge of banning a spectacle across an empire stretching from Britain to Syria. It's highly probable that local lanistae and provincial editors continued to stage these fights quietly, labeling them as something else, perhaps a staged myth or a simple animal hunt, to avoid imperial sanction, especially after the initial fervor surrounding the edict died down. Your life, even after the ban, might have continued in the shadows of some smaller provincial amphitheater far from Rome's watchful eye. You, as a gladiatrix whose livelihood depends on the games, feel the creeping chill of this decree. You're not just fighting for your life anymore. You're fighting against a cultural tide that has been officially institutionalized. The emperors who once tolerated your existence as a scandalous novelty now actively condemn you. Your career, already brutally short, has an official expiration date. The ban is a fascinating moment because it marks the point where the spectacle of the gladiatrix finally became too transgressive even for Rome. While the Romans loved blood sport, they also had a rigid, almost obsessive need for order. The female gladiator was an anomaly, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of gender and class. By 200 CE, the crack had become too wide for the imperial establishment to ignore, so they simply plastered over it with a law. After this date, the archaeological and literary evidence for female gladiators essentially dries up. You fade from the official historical record not because you stopped being interesting, but because you were legally erased. Your story becomes one that is deliberately suppressed, pushed to the margins of history, where we are trying to uncover it tonight. You might be lying in your cell in the ludus when the news of the ban filters down. Perhaps the lanista is furious seeing his most unique and bankable asset suddenly devalued. For you, it's a terrifying moment of uncertainty. Will you be retired? Sold or quietly executed to dispose of an illegal commodity, the emperor's decree intended to restore order to Rome casts a deep shadow of disorder over your already precarious life. The imperial ban of 200 CE hangs over your head, and now as you recover from the shock of Severus's decree, a more fundamental question arises about your identity and the identity of your peers. A status check, freeborn or slave. You are a gladiatrix, but what was your life before the arena? And what was the legal contract that bound you to the sand? The mainstream historical fact is that the gladiatorial profession, regardless of gender, was overwhelmingly dominated by slaves and condemned criminals, people with no rights whose bodies were the property of the lanista. If you were a slave girl sold into the ludus, the training school, your journey to the arena was involuntary. You didn't sign a contract. Your owner did, effectively selling your life for the profit of spectacle. This was the grim reality for the vast majority of gladiators, male or female. Your existence was dictated by the harsh economics of the slave market and the entertainment industry. However, the literary sources, the scornful whispers from Juvenal and Tacitus we looked at in Section 3 focus almost exclusively on the truly scandalous cases, the auctoratae. These were women who were freeborn citizens, perhaps even from aristocratic or equestrian families, who voluntarily signed a contract, auctoramentum, to become gladiators. The word auctorata means one who has hired herself out. This is the core of the quirky tidbit. A free woman willingly chose to forfeit her social standing and her rights for the thrill, the notoriety, or perhaps the sheer financial desperation of the arena. You can't help but pause and try to understand this mindset. Why would someone of status willingly embrace infamia, the deepest social shame a Roman could incur? It wasn't about a career change. It was a form of spectacular social suicide. Historians suggest a few motives. Firstly, financial ruin, perhaps a family debt or a desire for a large, quick sum of money that only a high-profile, high-risk contract could provide. Secondly, thrill-seeking and defiance. The Roman elite, particularly during the turbulent and extravagant periods of emperors like Nero and Domitian, were sometimes bored. The most extreme form of rebellion against the restrictive societal rules placed upon noblewomen was to put on a helmet and enter the arena. It was the ultimate two-fingers-up gesture to their conservative fathers and husbands. You can almost hear the gentle sarcasm. "Oh, you want me to be modest and domestic fine. Watch me fight a lion instead." The contract for the auctoratae was gruesome. You would legally swear to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword. Uri vinciri, verberari, feroc necari. It was a complete surrender of your physical autonomy and legal rights. Even if you were freeborn, the moment you signed that auctoramentum, you became legally equivalent to a slave for the duration of your contract, stripped of your citizenship and your reputation. This duality is why historians still argue whether the auctoratae were a truly significant demographic among gladiatrices, or if their prominence in literary sources is simply a result of the elite writers being more scandalized by their presence than by the fighting of slaves. In other words, did noblewomen fighting really happen often? Or did the Roman writers simply use the few instances they heard about to generate maximum moral outrage? You trudge along the wall of the ludus during a break and you look at your comrades. You realize the subtle but immense difference in their lives. The slave girl fights for survival and perhaps a chance at manumission freedom. The auctorata fights for the spectacle itself and for the brief, terrifying rush of fame. The slave has no choice. The auctorata has made the most extreme choice imaginable. And yet once the helmets are on the armor strapped tight, and the fight begins, the sharp point of the sword is utterly indifferent to the legal paperwork that brought you there. The risk is the same for both. A light joke to ease the tension, you realize that the 1st century CE version of a midlife crisis for a bored noblewoman wasn't buying a sports chariot. It was signing up to fight a bear on a Saturday afternoon. The social shame was permanent. Even if a freeborn gladiatrix survived her contract and retired, she could never fully escape the infamia. She was legally marked for life. She could never hold public office, never vote, and finding a respectable marriage would be virtually impossible. Her story would forever be an anecdote of her own disgrace. It's a sobering thought. Even in victory, the social contract of Roman life ensured you never truly won. Whether you are a slave who dreams of freedom or a noblewoman who threw away her freedom, you are both bound by the same bronze greaves and the same unforgiving sand. Your status might differ outside the arena, but within the spectacle, you are merely a body performing a lethal dance for the pleasure of the Roman crowd. Whether you were a slave or an auctoratae, the moment you signed your death warrant or were simply forced into the ludus, you became a professional killer entertainer. This brings us to the specifics of your toolkit and fighting style, armor and fighting styles compared. You need to understand that the female fighter wasn't just a woman handed a sword. You were a specialist trained in a defined, regulated Roman fighting class. The mainstream historical fact is that the gladiatrices generally adopted the established fighting types, the same classifications used for the men. You would be trained as a thraex Thracian, a myrmeo, named for a fish crest on their helmet, or a secutor, the pursuer. Each type had specific weaponry armor and rules of engagement. You didn't just pick up a sword. You were assigned a persona and a tactical identity. For example, if you were designated a thraex, you would receive the sicca, that short, curved scimitar we talked about designed to hook around an opponent's shield and reach vulnerable areas. You'd wear a large, crested helmet with a wide brim and grill that hid your face completely, a small square or round shield parma, and tall metal greaves on both legs. Your style was quick, aggressive, and aimed at sudden injury. If, conversely, you were a murmillo, you'd carry the large oblong shield scutum and the straight short sword gladius, the classic Roman infantry sword. Your helmet had a fish-shaped crest, and you wore a protective arm guard manica and one greave on the left leg. Your style was defensive, based on using the huge shield to absorb blows before launching a powerful counterattack. The quirky tidbit specific to female gladiators often involves the degree of armament. If you remember the Halicarnassus relief of Amazonia and Achillia from Section 4, their armor was significantly lighter than their male counterparts. They were shown fighting bare-chested and with minimal protection. This wasn't necessarily to make the fight deadlier, but to make the female form more visible, again feeding into the sexualized novelty of the spectacle. It also made the movements more fluid, allowing for a faster, more agile fight that the audience might perceive as more graceful or feminine even while attempting to kill. The lanista was selling speed and shock value, not necessarily brute force. You, as a gladiatrix, realize that your equipment is often a deliberate choice to enhance the look of the fight. The weight difference is a gentle historical joke you can appreciate. While the massive shields the male murmillos carried might have weighed 20 pounds, yours might be intentionally lighter, allowing for a more balletic, albeit deadly performance. You are performing a duel, but you are also performing a role. This distinction in gear, especially the emphasis on less than full coverage, leads us to the open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the gladiatrices' lighter armament was mandated by the physical limitations of the female body, or if it was primarily a deliberate choice by the editor to increase the visual drama and shock value of the contest. Was the lanista saying, "She can't carry that"? Or was he saying, "The crowd will pay more to see her in this"? Given the Roman emphasis on spectacle above all else, the latter is often given more weight. The arena was the ultimate expression of panem et circenses bred, and circuses, and your light armor was simply part of the circus. You trudge into the armamentarium, the armory, and the smith hands you your helmet. The weight of the metal feels familiar and paradoxically comforting. It's the last barrier between your face and the crowd, and between your head and a fatal blow. You realize the equipment defines not just how you fight, but who you are for the 20 minutes of the show. You're not Julia or Livia anymore. You are a living, breathing secutor, the hunter of the nimble retiarius Evan, though you're facing another woman, not a man with a net. The rules of the class structure are rigidly imposed, ensuring that even in the chaos of the fight, the audience can follow the established tropes and expectations of Roman combat. It's an ancient form of sports commentary. They know the style, they know the gear, and they know the weaknesses, even before the first clash of steel. Your training in the ludus was focused on exploiting the specific weaknesses of your designated opponent's class. A murmillo must watch out for the Thraix curved sica. The secutor must keep the retiarius's net and trident at bay. Even when you are fighting another woman of the same classes, Amazonia fought Achillia. The sheer novelty of the mirror match would have been the draw. It becomes a test of pure skill, a double negative, that somehow resulted in a massive, positive spectacle. You feel the cool steel of your gladius resting against your wrist and take a deep breath. The performance is about to begin. You are armored, categorized, and you know the fighting style expected of you. But standing ready to enter the arena, you must consider the perspective of the 70,000 Romans staring down at you. We shift focus now to what the audience saw and how your presence transformed the violent ritual into something almost illicit, the spectacle eroticized and unusual. The mainstream historical fact is that the Romans craved novelty in their spectacles. They had seen thousands of male gladiators fight. The novelty of female combat, however, introduced an entirely new, deeply transgressive dynamic. The gladiatrix was an anomaly, and her rarity was a powerful market force. Your lanista knew that the simple presence of a woman with a sword would triple the ticket price. You were the ultimate historical equivalent of a limited-time engagement. This pursuit of novelty inevitably led to the eroticization of the spectacle. If you remember the Halicarnassus relief from Section 4, the women were depicted with minimal clothing fighting bare-chested. This was no accident. The Roman crowd, particularly the men, viewed the female body as belonging strictly to the domestic private sphere. To see it exposed, sweating, and weaponized in the public arena was a profound visual shock and, for many, a sexual thrill. The armor was designed not just for protection, but for maximum dramatic effect and, yes, visual titillation. The quirky tidbit in this section lies in the contrast between the gladiatrix and the Roman social ideals. A respectable Roman woman, the matrona, was expected to be fully covered, reserved and almost invisible, in public embodying chastity and pudicitia modesty. You, the gladiatrix, were the living inversion of this ideal. You were loud, exposed, active, and overtly violent. This inversion was the point. The audience could indulge in fantasies of powerful, unrestrained femininity, knowing that this powerful figure was at the same time a piece of property utterly under their control and disposable at the whim of the editor. The power you wielded was a temporary, stage-managed illusion. The poets, like Juvenal, whom we met in Section 3, only fueled this dynamic by complaining about it. They lamented the fact that respectable men were becoming infatuated with these shameful figures. The more the elite complained about the moral decay, the more popular the female fighters became, with the masses creating a vicious cycle of scandal and sensationalism. This tension between sex and violence leads to the open scholarly debate phrase, historians still argue whether the gladiatrices' attire and presentation were primarily intended to be sexually titillating for the audience, or if the emphasis on minimal armor was purely a stylistic choice to evoke the myth of the Amazon warrior, thereby legitimizing the fight as an exotic display. It's probably a bit of both. The Lanistae were shrewd businessmen. They wrapped the erotic spectacle in the respectable guise of classical mythology. They're not just women. The promoter would say they're Amazon's myth made real. It was a clever way to sell something morally questionable under a cloak of cultural legitimacy. You feel the pressure of those eyes. You are not just a fighter. You are a performer of a forbidden narrative. You are the Roman fantasy of the warrior woman, the ultimate subversion of their own social order, and your performance has to be flawless. It's an exhausting contradiction. You must be the perfect warrior while simultaneously performing the ideal female warrior fantasy for a deeply patriarchal audience. You have to be strong enough to wield the gladius and vulnerable enough to be considered a thrill. A light joke here. You realize that being a gladiatrix was the only job in ancient Rome where showing up without a shirt was a contractual obligation and simultaneously a massive career boost. Talk about a complex uniform policy. The spectacle extends beyond your outfit. Your movements, your roars, your deliberate shield clangs, it's all theater. You trudge across the sand, your heart pounding, knowing that every moment of the fight is being judged not just for lethal efficiency, but for dramatic flair. You are a star, however fleeting, on the biggest, bloodiest stage the world has ever known. And the sheer transgressive unusualness of your position is the reason you are alive for this short, violent performance. The spectacle has begun. You've endured the preparation, you've worn the minimal armor, and you've felt the transgressive thrill of the crowd's eyes. Now we detail the event itself, the short, brutal truth of your employment, the munus and the aftermath. The munus is the Latin term for a gladiatorial show, a duty or offering, and for you it is the moment when all the barley and all the blistering training are put to the final fatal test. The mainstream historical fact is that the gladiatorial contest was less a chaotic brawl and more a highly regulated duel with a referee or summa rudis in attendance. You are not fighting until one of you simply drops from exhaustion. You are fighting according to strict ritualistic rules that govern your weapon use and your movements. You trudge across the sand, your feet stirring up the bloody dust, and the referee's presence ensures that the fight proceeds correctly, to maximize the spectacle, of course, but also to prevent cheap, clumsy, or dishonorable kills. The fight itself is a dizzying blur of effort. You feel the clang of your opponent's sword against your shield, a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil, ending a vibration up your arm that momentarily numbs your fingers. You remember the training in the ludus section 2 and rely on muscle memory. You duck under a swing counter with a thrust and hear the metallic scraping sound as the point of your blade catches your opponent's greave. The crowd roars a massive, encouraging wave of sound that pushes you forward despite the pain in your lungs. You are not thinking about survival. You are thinking about the next immediate movement. Survival is a consequence, not a goal. When one of you is wounded badly enough to signal defeat, often by dropping your shield, raising a finger, or simply collapsing to your knees, the fight is paused. This is the terrifying moment of judgment where the cost of your munus is calculated. Your quirky tidbit in this ritual is the payment. If you are a slave, you don't personally receive payment, but your lanista makes a considerable amount of money, which increases your market value if you win. If you are an auctoratae, the freeborn volunteer from Section 6, you are fighting for the money agreed upon in your auctoramentum contract. This payment was often substantial, large enough to tempt a free woman to sign away her life and her social status. However, a significant chunk of that money would immediately go to the lanista to cover your training upkeep and medical care. So you might win, and your purse might be impressive, but the net profit for you might be surprisingly small, especially when weighed against the risk of Farouk Nekari being killed by the sword. The moment you are defeated and signal surrender, the decision of life or death rests with the editor, the person who sponsored the games. You look up at the box where this man, or sometimes woman, sits. He is the one who will decide your fate, usually consulting the crowd. The famous thumbs up or thumbs down gesture is actually a massive scholarly debate itself. Historians still argue whether the thumb-down gesture meant sheathe the sword, sparing a life, or thrust down, killing the person, or if the pollis verso turned thumb was just a general signal of condemnation that could be interpreted differently depending on the region. The more accepted theory is that a closed fist with an extended thumb pointing sideways or upwards was the signal for mercy missio, while a thumb pointed towards the throat or heart, or sometimes down, was the signal for the final fatal blow. You kneel in the sand, your heart hammering, awaiting the decision. If the crowd is impressed, as they were with Amazonia and Achillia, Section 4, they may demand missio. If they feel cheated, or if you fought poorly, they will roar for blood. If you are spared, you receive first aid immediately. Gladiators were valuable property, and their wounds were often treated with a high level of care by specialized physicians. You are dragged off to the infirmary for stitching, bandaging, and a lot of pain relief, which often involved wine. But if the editor signals the killing blow, you face the final immediate end. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, a gentle callback to a previous series I might have done. Well, the one thing no one ever forgets is the smell of the arena floor when the fight is done, blood vinegar, sand, and cheap incense used to mask the smell of the dead. Your munus is over, and your only reward is the right to breathe another day or a final brief release from the ludus life. You've survived the munus, or perhaps you're simply training for the next one, trying to forget the roar of the crowd and the smell of the sand. Now we pull back from the heart of Rome and cast a wider net across the vast Roman Empire to see if the gladiatrix was a central Roman phenomenon or a sporadic event, archaeological clues beyond Rome. You realize that the silence of the Roman historians may just be a matter of geography, not necessarily rarity. The mainstream historical fact is that the gladiatorial games were not confined to the Colosseum. Amphitheaters existed in hundreds of cities throughout the Roman provinces, from Britain to North Africa. The games were a crucial part of Romanizing the conquered world, a key piece of panem et circenses, bread and circuses designed to keep the populace entertained and loyal. And where there were games, there was a market for spectacle, including you. Our search for the physical evidence takes us far from the marble of Italy to the muddy plains of Londinium, Roman London. This is the source of the quirky tidbit in this section, the discovery of a burial that some archaeologists believe belongs to a female gladiator. Near what was once the Roman settlement, a cremation burial was found dating to the 1st century. See, precisely the period when Tacitus noted female fighters. The woman's remains were interred with luxury items, including expensive lamps showing gladiators in action, a type of pine cone associated with arena rituals, and crucially, a small bowl of burnt bones that suggests a funerary feast. While we can't definitively say this is Amazonia's sister, the burial site known as the Great Dover Street Burial is highly unusual. The fact that a woman was buried with such distinctively gladiatorial public and high-status funerary goods suggests she held a unique professional role tied to the games. She wasn't a respectable matrona. She was someone whose identity was defined by the arena. Perhaps an auctoratae, the freeborn volunteer from Section 6 who had earned enough money to afford an expensive send-off, even with the accompanying infamia social shame. The possibility that your career extended all the way to the edges of the known world, to a misty, perpetually damp Roman outpost like Britain, is a powerful thought. Other evidence, while sparse, supports this geographic spread. Inscriptions from various provincial locations occasionally mention games that included female fighters. A particularly interesting find comes from Oporto, Portugal, ancient Portuscal, which references a gladiatrix in a local context. These fragments, far from the critical eye of Rome's snooty historians, suggest that the gladiatrix was a semi-regular feature in the provincial circuits. She was a valuable traveling attraction, a way for the local editor to prove his municipal status by staging a show as exotic as anything seen in the capital. This leads us to the open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the scattering of archaeological finds across the provinces, like those in London and Oporto, suggest a widespread but small-scale phenomenon, or if the lack of more finds indicates that female gladiators were genuinely rare and only used sporadically to generate hype. Were you a regular member of a ludus in every major city? Or did your lanista keep you as a special traveling exhibit, carting you across the empire like a prize animal? You trudge through the logistical realities, the vastness of the empire, the hundreds of legions, the thousands of miles. means that your story could have unfolded anywhere. You might have left the hot, dusty streets of Rome and found yourself sailing on a trireme across the Mediterranean, heading for an arena in North Africa or Greece, where the architectural style and the audience's language were entirely different, but the smell of the sand and the weight of your helmet remained exactly the same. The ubiquity of the amphitheater proves the ubiquity of the spectacle. A gentle joke. You realize that being a gladiatrix in the provinces was the ancient Roman version of a rock band's world tour, except instead of selling t-shirts, you were selling the chance to see you almost die. The silence of the Roman writers then becomes less about the infrequency of the event, and more about the simple fact that what happened in a muddy amphitheater in Britain was just not deemed important enough for a senator in Rome to bother recording. But the artifacts, a shard of pottery here, a stylized lamp there, whisper the truth. Your forgotten life was lived not just in the shadow of the Colosseum, but under the harsh sun of every Roman sky. The dust of the provincial arenas has settled, but the sound of the games never truly leaves you. Every gladiator's life, including yours, was experienced in a constant, overwhelming sensory environment. We now turn our attention from the visual spectacle to the auditory one, the tubicin, and the soundscape. You need to feel the noise, the rhythm, and the terrifying oral structure of your performance. The mainstream historical fact is that Roman games were not quiet. They were an absolute sonic assault, deliberately orchestrated to heighten the drama and mask the grim realities. The noise was constant, the collective roar of the crowd, the cries of vendors selling wine and snacks, the metallic clatter of armor, and the specific piercing sounds of the tubicines, the trumpet players who stood as the arena's orchestral conductors. The tubicin played the tuba, a long, straight bronze horn, not the modern instrument you're probably picturing. These blasts were used for specific signals, acting as the arena's official cues. You trudged through the dark hypogeum tunnel, remembering the moments just before your entrance. The air is thick and damp, and then a sudden high-pitched, sustained note slices through the darkness. That's your cue. The specific sound of the tubicin signaling the entrance of the gladiators is the quirky tidbit that marks the transition from training to lethal performance. It's an almost religious sound, separating the profane world outside from the consecrated killing ground of the arena. The soundscape was essential to the choreography of the Munus Section 9. The horns would announce the beginning of the fight, the pausing for surrender, and the final somber note for the delivery of the coup de grâce mercy stroke, or the final kill. The rhythmic drumbeat of the hydraulis, a type of water organ, and the clashing cymbals would accompany the fight itself, setting a frenzied driving tempo. You realized that your duel wasn't just a fight, it was a dance set to a specific terrifying score. The music wasn't meant to be subtle. It was meant to be overwhelming, designed to induce a kind of collective frenzy in the audience and perhaps in you. This leads us to the open, scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the extreme volume and constant orchestration of the gladiatorial games were intended primarily to amplify the excitement or if they were used as a psychological tool to drown out the sounds of suffering, thereby allowing the audience and the fighters to maintain a degree of emotional distance from the killing. You, as a gladiatrix, feel the noise as a physical entity. It's a roar that presses down on your helmet, a constant pressure that makes concentrating on your opponent a supreme act of will. You rely on visual cues, your doctor's silent hand signals from the edge of the sand, and the Summa Rudis' shouted instructions, because the sound of the crowd is 1,000 voices trying to claim your attention. Imagine the unique sound surrounding your entrance, the gladiatrix. While the tubicines played the standard entrance fanfare, the audience reaction would have been distinct. A surge of excited chatter, a sudden collective gasp of recognition, and perhaps a specific, slightly more decadent or appreciative applause than that reserved for the standard male duels. You are the novelty, the rare event, and your sound profile is unique. A gentle joke to cut the tension. You realize that the volume in the Colosseum was so high, if ancient Romans had ear protection, they'd have been considered soft. You, the gladiator, just had to deal with the ringing in your ears, along with the existential threat. You feel the sand beneath your boots as you take your fighting stance, and the noise level spikes again. The clamor is your reality, a reminder that you are a spectacle amplified by the music and the 70,000 throats above you. Even if you survived the fight, the sound of that tuba would be imprinted on your memory, the brassy, metallic final declaration that you were for a brief violent moment the absolute focus of the Roman world. You've survived the deafening roar of the arena and the terrifying decision of the editor. Now let's contemplate the almost impossible scenario, the ultimate long-shot victory, the strange, tainted nature of your freedom, life post-arena, retirement, and shame. If you are still breathing, your ordeal is not necessarily over. It has just shifted its focus. The mainstream historical fact is that the life expectancy of a gladiator was brutally short. The odds were against you in every munus section, 9. Therefore, a gladiatrix who survived long enough to earn her release or manumission was an extreme rarity. For a slave woman, freedom would have been the ultimate life-altering reward. This freedom was often symbolized by the granting of a wooden sword, the rudis, which marked you as a retired veteran who was now legally immune from fighting again. You would clutch that wooden sword, a trophy, symbolizing your endurance, as you walked out of the ludus for the final time. For an auctoratae, the freeborn volunteer from Section 6 retirement, meant the completion of her contract and the legal reclaiming of her freedom. She had survived the oath to be killed by the sword. She had earned the money stipulated in her auctoramentum. But here is where the reality of Roman society sets in. The quirky tidbit of your retirement is that your freedom came with a permanent, indelible stain, infamia. You remember this term from Section 6. It meant that even as a free woman, you were permanently branded with social shame. The very act of appearing publicly in the arena, regardless of your fighting prowess or the money you earned, rendered you legally and socially degraded. You could not marry into a respectable family. Your testimony in court would be considered unreliable, and you would be forever shunned by the Roman elite. Your success had bought you freedom, but not respectability. You were a walking contradiction, a famous, wealthy pariah. You trudge out into the Roman form, a free woman, but you quickly realize the limits of this liberty. People point, they whisper. The fame that was so valuable to your lanista is now a cage preventing you from integrating back into normal life. Imagine trying to find a peaceful domestic existence when your face, or at least the memory of your fighting style and scant armor Section 8 was known to thousands of Roman men. The retirement of a gladiatrix was often a lonely, socially isolated affair. This social reality leads to the open, scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the infamia and social isolation faced by retired gladiatrices drove them back toward the only communities that accepted them, such as teaching in the ludus or managing gladiatorial businesses, or if they managed to completely vanish into the anonymity of the Roman lower classes. Did you become a doctrix, a female instructor back in the training school, teaching the next generation of novici, Section 2? Or did you take your small fortune and move to a distant province to try and escape your past? The latter would have been incredibly difficult, as Roman society was built on reputation and familial ties. A light, gentle joke. You realize that the Roman version of witness protection for a retired gladiator was simply hoping no one recognized the woman who was once fighting a leopard bare-chested in the main stadium. If you became a doctrix, your role would shift. You wouldn't be fighting to the death, but fighting to teach. You'd stand on the training ground now, fully clothed, correcting the stances of the new recruits against the palace Section 2, using the weight of your experience to train them. You'd be revered by the recruits for your survival, but still shunned by the society outside the high walls of the school. You are a walking legend of violence, unable to lay down the weight of your history. Your successful retirement, then, is a complex, bittersweet affair. You survived the death sentence of the arena, but you live on with the lifelong sentence of social exclusion. Your memory etched in stone like the Halicarnassus relief. Section 4 remains permanent proof of your courage, but also of your profound societal transgression. You are free, but you are not clean in the eyes of Rome. You've contemplated the difficult life of a retired gladiatrix, a life defined by freedom and infamia. Now we need to clarify a crucial distinction within the world of female arena performers, separating the warrior from the hunter, connecting the dots, venatrix versus gladiatrix. Not every woman who stepped onto the blood-soaked sand was there to fight another person to the death. The mainstream historical fact is that the Roman games were structured into three main parts: the animal hunts venations in the morning, the executions of criminals at noon, and the gladiatorial duels in the afternoon. The term gladiatrix, as we've been using it, refers specifically to the women who fought other people, usually other women, as we established in Section 7. The term venatrix, however, refers to the women who specialized in the morning spectacle, the hunters of animals. The role of the venatrix was less constrained by the strict fighting class rules, triax myrmillo, etc., that governed your life as a gladiatrix. Her task was to hunt, fight, and kill exotic animals, bears, lions, leopards, or even deer and boar in the arena. You recall seeing them practice in the ludus Section 2, working with specialized spears and light armor, practicing their footwork not against a human opponent, but against the movements of a caged beast. The quirky tidbit is that the literary sources, especially those focused on moral decay, often conflated the two roles, or perhaps focused on the venatrices because their appearance was often even more shocking. A few accounts speak of noble women, the auctoratae, from Section 6, who, wishing to retain some shred of aristocratic dignity, while still seeking the arena thrill, chose to become venatrices. They might have viewed the hunting of a leopard as a more honorable or classical act than engaging in the servile duel of a gladiator. The Emperor Domitian, for example, is recorded as having hosted games featuring women hunting wild beasts, and these were arguably less offensive to the conservative eye than two women hacking at each other with swords. This distinction is important because the venatrix might have had slightly less infamia attached to her name, or at least a different flavor of it. The animal hunt was an old Roman tradition, often tied to military prowess and classical mythology. By hunting, the venatrix was in a twisted way aligning herself with the heroic tradition of mythological figures like Diana the huntress. The gladiatrix, however, was aligning herself with the lower-class disposable existence of the slave duelist. You, as a gladiatrix, might feel a slight, weary disdain for the venatrix. While your own profession is steeped in violence, at least your opponent is a fellow human, trained and armed. The venatrix faces a terrifying, unpredictable force of nature, often in a hunt sequence that is less about ritualistic skill and more about sheer survival against overwhelming odds. The smell of the wild animal cages in the Hypogeum Section 1 was a constant reminder of their parallel yet distinct profession. This leads us to the open scholarly debate phrase historians still argue whether the formal ban on female gladiators issued by Septimius Severus in 200 CE Section 5 included venatrices, or if women continued to hunt animals in the arena long after they stopped fighting each other. Because the animal hunts were an earlier and less transgressive form of spectacle than the duels, some scholars believe the venatrices were tolerated for a longer period. It's possible that when the gladiatrix were forced to retire or go underground, your sister in arms, the venatrix was still permitted her deadly trade, albeit with continued imperial scrutiny. A light, gentle joke. He realized the venatrix had one distinct professional advantage. She never had to worry about what fighting style her opponent was using. A bear is always a bear, regardless of its armor class. The core takeaway is that the forgotten female gladiators is an umbrella term. Within that history are specialized roles, each with its own level of risk, scandal, and social cost. You might trudge past the venatrix in the corridor beneath the Colosseum, her spear rattling lightly, and know that you are both bound to the sand, both infames, but bound by slightly different types of blood and spectacle. You've explored the gritty reality of the arena, the training, the armor, the rules, and the enduring infamia. Now we take a giant leap forward from the 2nd century CE to your own time, the 21st century, and examine how the myth of the female warrior is often represented missing the crucial context of your life echoes in modern culture. The mainstream historical fact is that modern popular culture is saturated with images of the female warrior from the mythological Wonder Woman and Xena warrior princess to the very real and often romanticized historical figures of the Celts and the Vikings. These figures are generally portrayed as heroes fighting for justice, resisting tyranny, or embodying noble freedom. They are powerful, self-directed agents of change. But when the actual Roman gladiatrix, appear in film or literature, you are often stripped of your complexity. The quirky tidbit here is that modern portrayals tend to overemphasize two things: the exotic, sexualized novelty, the minimal armor we discussed in Section 8, and the heroic rebellion. You are often shown as a noble princess or a senator's daughter who fights for freedom or to escape an evil lanista. This is a necessary narrative shortcut for modern audiences who prefer a simple, inspiring storyline. You, the real gladiatrix, who was overwhelmingly a slave or a criminal, bound by a contract of spectacular self-destruction. No, this is a profound simplification. You realize that your reality of infamia, social shame, and forced service, Section 6 is too ugly, too deeply uncomfortable, and too morally challenging for a 2-hour action movie. It's a gentle historical joke. Modern audiences love the idea of the rebellious warrior woman, but they shy away from the horrific reality of the enslaved, disposable entertainer you truly were. They want the Amazonia of the mythological name Section 4, not the barley-eating, socially dead commodity of the ludus Section 2. This leads us to the open, scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the modern romanticization of figures like the gladiatrix serves to popularize ancient history, or if it fundamentally distorts the brutal social and economic realities of Roman slavery and gender inequality. While the attention is welcome, It obscures the fact that your choice, if you had one at all, was a choice between a horrible life and a quick public death. The courage you exhibited was less about seeking glory and more about the absolute terrifying will to survive one more afternoon. You are a cautionary tale, not an inspiration. You were a tool used by the Roman elite to demonstrate their power in the modern world by focusing only on your strength and ignoring your bondage, participates in a kind of historical sanitization. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, the callback from Section 9. That was the reality. The grit, the smell, the Sagina diet, the constant fear. Modern culture gives you sleek leather armor, a dramatic backstory, and a righteous cause. It takes away your infamia, your low status, and the simple fact that the vast majority of your peers were fighting because they had no other choice. You are the missing link between the myth and the brutal reality. You trudge on through the noise of the 21st century, a silent, complex figure whose fame came at the cost of your very humanity. You've tracked the gladiatrix from the stench of the ludus to the roar of the arena, and finally to the sanitized, heroic versions of the modern screen. We conclude now by confronting the final frustrating question: why, despite the undeniable physical evidence, Section 4, and the undeniable spectacle? Section 8. Did you, the powerful female fighter, so completely vanish from the historical memory, the inevitable fade from history? The mainstream historical fact is that your erasure was not accidental. It was systemic. It was a perfect storm of political will, social prejudice, and the simple mechanics of historical preservation. The Imperial ban issued by Septimius Severus in 200 CE, Section 5, was the official death knell. Once the practice was illegal, no respectable editor or lanista dared to advertise it, and no respectable historian or poet would risk imperial displeasure by writing about it. The record simply went silent by decree. Your social status or lack thereof also played a crucial role in this fade. You were an infame's socially shamed commodity, whether you were a slave or an auctoratae. Section 6. History, especially the written history that survives, is primarily the story of the elite, the senators, the emperors, and the generals. These are the people who commissioned the statues, wrote the books, and had the resources to ensure their memory endured. You, the gladiator, were disposable entertainment. The powerful had no interest in preserving the story of someone who was legally and morally degraded. The quirky tidbit in this final section relates to the materials of documentation. Think about what survived monumental inscriptions on marble, like the Halicarnassus relief, which were rare and expensive, and literary works on parchment written by the elite. What didn't survive were the common everyday records, the Lanista's daily account books, the small wooden plaques advertising a provincial munus, Section 10, or the cheap papyrus scrolls noting the outcomes of the smaller fights. These materials, which would have contained the names and exploits of dozens of gladiatrices, simply crumbled to dust. Your story was written on the sand of the arena floor, and the rain of history washed it away. This leads us to the final, necessary, open, scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the gladiatrices' fade from memory should be attributed primarily to the imperial ban's effectiveness or to the deeper, pervasive Roman reluctance to acknowledge the active, public role of women outside of acceptable social roles. Was it the law or was it the culture? It was a vicious circle. The culture found you transgressive, which led to the law banning you, which then solidified the cultural tendency to ignore your existence entirely. You were a phenomenon that the Roman world desperately wanted to forget, and over time they succeeded. You, the last forgotten figure, stand at the end of this long, slow journey. You were a warrior whose existence questioned the very core of Roman values. Your skill, your survival, and your shame were all inconvenient truths that the empire preferred to bury under layers of marble and mythology. The wind down begins now. The story is complete, and the long road of ancient Rome is fading into the mists of time. You've earned your rest. Now, as the echoes of the arena finally soften and the image of the curved Sika and the shining greaves slowly retreats from your mind, allow your body to settle deeply into the mattress below you. The noise of the 70,000 people, the blare of the Tubitaine, and the scrape of the steel against the bronze, all those sounds that have accompanied our journey, are now fading away, becoming nothing more than the gentle hum of the night outside your window. You are no longer on the sharp, unforgiving sand of the arena. You are safe, you are warm, and you are far away from the demanding scrutiny of the ancient crowd. These women, the Amazonia and the Achillia, whose names we found in the stone, they fought a battle not just against each other, but against the sheer, monumental indifference of history. Their fight for survival was as intense as their struggle for memory. But for tonight, their story is told, and their courage is remembered even if only in the soft space between your waking and sleeping thoughts. Feel the weight of the blanket, the cool sensation of the air, and let the historical facts, the bands, the barley, the shame, and the glory dissolve into a gentle stream of abstract, peaceful images. There is no more fighting now. There is no more training, only the slow, rhythmic sound of your own quiet breathing. Everything is calm. Everything is still. Just ease back, let go of the last few threads of thought, and welcome the deep, peaceful quiet of the coming sleep. Sweet dreams, sweet dreams.